Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we are witnessing a moment that cuts straight to the heart of American democracy, a moment where power, accountability, and temperament collide in full public view. As Congress issues a shock demand, one that challenges executive behavior, political norms, and the rule of law, we see a familiar pattern erupt once again. An explosive meltdown from Donald Trump. Democracy under fire is not a metaphor chosen for drama. It is a description of a condition that emerges when the basic rules holding a system together are repeatedly tested, bent, and openly challenged. Democracy depends not on a single election or a single leader, but on shared acceptance of limits, limits on power, limits on authority, and limits on personal grievance. When those limits are treated as optional, democracy does not collapse instantly, it begins to fray. The danger lies not only in dramatic acts but in the slow normalization of behavior that would once have been unthinkable. At the center of this pressure is the idea of accountability. In a functioning democracy, accountability is not punishment, revenge, or political warfare. It is the mechanism that ensures power remains temporary and conditional. When leaders are questioned, investigated, or asked to comply with lawful oversight, the system is doing what it was designed to do. But when accountability is rebranded as persecution and oversight is framed as sabotage, the very language of democracy is turned against itself. Citizens are encouraged to see institutions as enemies rather than safeguards. Democracy comes under fire when emotional loyalty replaces civic responsibility. The moment political identity becomes inseparable from personal allegiance to a single figure, criticism starts to feel like betrayal and facts start to feel negotiable. This environment rewards outrage over reason and volume over evidence. It trains the public to respond instinctively rather than thoughtfully, to choose sides before understanding the issue, and to dismiss uncomfortable truths as attacks rather than warnings. The role of institutions becomes especially critical during these moments. Congress, courts, and independent media are not obstacles to democracy, they are its structural supports. When these institutions are undermined through constant accusation and ridicule, public trust erodes. The danger is not that people disagree with institutions, but that they are taught to reject the idea of neutral authority altogether. Without shared trust in process, even legitimate outcomes are viewed as illegitimate by those who dislike the result. Democracy is also under fire when chaos becomes a tactic. Confusion can be more effective than censorship because it overwhelms rather than silences. A flood of claims, denials, counterclaims, and emotional reactions makes it difficult for truth to surface. In this fog, people disengage, deciding that nothing can be known for certain and that participation is pointless. This withdrawal benefits those who prefer fewer checks on power and less public scrutiny. Leadership plays a defining role in either stabilizing or destabilizing democratic norms. Leaders who respect democracy accept limits even when it is inconvenient. They respond to oversight with argument, evidence, or cooperation, not rage. When leaders instead model hostility toward rules, they signal to supporters that rules themselves are optional. Over time, this behavior reshapes expectations, teaching citizens to tolerate actions that once would have triggered immediate alarm. Media, too, becomes a battlefield. Independent journalism is essential for democratic accountability, yet it is often targeted precisely because it exposes inconsistencies and abuses. When journalists are portrayed as enemies rather than investigators, the public is encouraged to distrust verified information. This does not eliminate facts, but it fractures reality into competing narratives, each insulated from correction. A democracy cannot function when citizens no longer agree on basic facts, even if they disagree on interpretation. The public's role in a democracy under fire is complex and often uncomfortable. Democracy asks more than passive consumption. It requires discernment, patience, and the willingness to sit with information that challenges existing beliefs. When outrage becomes addictive and simplicity is preferred over complexity, democratic engagement becomes shallow. The system still exists, but its substance is hollowed out by disengagement and cynicism. History shows that democracies rarely fall because people openly demand authoritarianism. They weaken because people grow exhausted, confused, and distrustful. Each dismissed norm, each ignored safeguard, and each justified overreach becomes another small crack. Individually, these moments seem survivable. Collectively, they reshape what is considered acceptable. Democracy under fire is not a single event but a condition sustained by repetition, where the extraordinary becomes ordinary and the unacceptable becomes familiar. Power versus accountability is one of the oldest tensions in democratic systems, and it resurfaces whenever authority is challenged by rules meant to restrain it. Power seeks freedom of action, speed, and dominance, while accountability demands explanation, transparency, and limits. Democracy exists precisely because these two forces are kept in balance. When power grows impatient with accountability, the system begins to tilt, not dramatically at first, but subtly through language, behavior, and expectation. Power is most comfortable when it is unquestioned. It thrives on loyalty, repetition, and the appearance of inevitability. Accountability, by contrast, interrupts momentum. It asks for records, justification, and consistency. It slows things down. That friction is not a flaw, it is a safeguard. The moment accountability is portrayed as obstruction rather than protection, power gains an advantage not by strength, but by redefining the rules of engagement. In democratic societies, accountability is impersonal by design. It does not care who holds office, how popular they are, or how loudly they object. Its legitimacy comes from process, not personality. When leaders personalize accountability, framing it as a personal insult or a political vendetta, they shift the focus away from actions and toward emotions. This shift benefits power because emotions are easier to mobilize than facts, and loyalty is easier to demand than compliance with law. Power versus accountability becomes especially volatile when leaders equate themselves with the will of the people. This framing turns oversight into an attack not just on an individual, but on an entire group of supporters. Accountability is then recast as elitism, betrayal, or sabotage. Once this narrative takes hold, institutions enforcing rules are no longer seen as neutral referees but as hostile actors. The public is encouraged to choose sides rather than evaluate evidence. The danger intensifies when power controls the narrative faster than accountability can respond. Accountability relies on documentation, hearings, and verification, all of which take time. Power operates in real time, using statements, social platforms, and emotional appeals to define reality before facts are fully examined. By the time accountability speaks, the audience may already be exhausted or polarized, less interested in truth than in defending their chosen side. This imbalance creates a cycle where power grows more aggressive and accountability appears weaker, even when it is functioning correctly. Each attempt to enforce rules is met with louder resistance, and each act of resistance is used as proof that accountability itself is illegitimate. Over time, the question shifts from whether rules were broken to whether rules should apply at all. That shift represents a profound erosion of democratic norms. Institutions tasked with accountability face a paradox in this struggle. If they act forcefully, they are accused of overreach. If they act cautiously, they are accused of weakness. Power exploits this bind by framing any outcome as evidence of bias. The goal is not necessarily to win the argument, but to undermine confidence in the process so thoroughly that outcomes no longer matter. Citizens are not neutral observers in this conflict. Power depends on public disengagement as much as it depends on public support. When people grow tired of investigations, hearings, and debates, they may accept simplicity over scrutiny. Accountability is dismissed as noise, and power benefits from the silence that follows. Democracy suffers not because people choose tyranny, but because they choose comfort over vigilance. The struggle between power and accountability is not resolved by elections alone. Elections determine who holds power, but accountability determines how that power is used. Without enforcement of limits between elections, power accumulates habits that outlast any single term. Accountability, when weakened, does not fail loudly. It fades quietly, becoming symbolic rather than effective. Power versus accountability ultimately reveals what a society values more: control or restraint, dominance or responsibility, loyalty or law. When power consistently wins this struggle, democracy does not disappear overnight. It continues to exist in form but not in substance, operating on rituals rather than principles, where authority is asserted confidently and accountability is treated as an inconvenience rather than a necessity. The meltdown that exposed everything was not defined by a single outburst or a fleeting moment of anger, but by what that anger revealed when the filters fell away. Public meltdowns matter not because they are dramatic, but because they strip away rehearsed discipline and expose instincts that usually remain hidden. When power is calm, it can pretend to respect limits. When power is enraged, it shows how it truly views restraint, oversight, and opposition. A meltdown is often dismissed as emotional weakness, but in politics it can function as a form of communication. It sends a message to allies and critics alike about how authority reacts when challenged. In this case, the intensity of the response revealed a deeper discomfort with scrutiny itself. The volume was not accidental. It was a signal meant to dominate attention, redirect focus, and reframe the situation away from substance and toward spectacle. What was exposed most clearly was a fragile relationship with accountability. Rather than addressing questions or processes directly, the meltdown transformed a procedural demand into a personal confrontation. This shift is revealing because it suggests an inability or unwillingness to separate office from self. When every challenge is perceived as an attack on identity, cooperation becomes impossible and compromise becomes betrayal. The system's mechanisms are no longer seen as neutral, but as hostile forces to be defeated. The meltdown also exposed how grievance can be weaponized. Anger was not merely expressed, it was aimed. Institutions were named, motives were assigned, and loyalty was demanded implicitly. Supporters were invited to share the outrage not by examining evidence but by absorbing emotion. This dynamic turns political engagement into a reflex rather than a reasoned act, rewarding intensity over understanding and allegiance over evaluation. Another layer revealed by the meltdown was a deep reliance on chaos as strategy. Disorder creates cover. When attention is scattered across insults, counterattacks, and sensational statements, it becomes harder to focus on the original issue. The meltdown did not resolve questions, it buried them under noise. This tactic benefits power by exhausting the public and overwhelming the media ecosystem, making sustained scrutiny difficult to maintain. The response also exposed the vulnerability of democratic norms to repetition. A single meltdown might shock, but repeated meltdowns condition the audience. What once seemed extraordinary becomes expected, even mundane. Outrage loses its ability to alarm, and abnormal behavior becomes part of the political landscape. This normalization is dangerous not because people approve of it, but because they stop reacting to it with urgency. The meltdown revealed the asymmetry between emotional force and institutional process. Institutions move slowly by design, relying on documentation, deliberation, and procedure. A meltdown moves instantly, traveling faster than facts and shaping perception before verification can occur. This imbalance allows emotional narratives to harden into beliefs, even when later evidence contradicts them. By the time corrections arrive, many have already chosen what to believe. It also exposed how personal branding can overshadow public responsibility. The reaction centered not on the implications for governance or law, but on personal vindication and perceived disrespect. This focus reduces public office to a platform for self-defense rather than service. When leadership becomes indistinguishable from ego, decisions are driven by pride instead of principle, and the public interest becomes secondary. The meltdown further highlighted the pressure placed on democratic institutions to absorb abuse without response. Courts, legislatures, and oversight bodies are expected to remain restrained even as they are attacked. This restraint is often misinterpreted as weakness, reinforcing the narrative that institutions lack legitimacy. In reality, restraint is a feature of democracy, but it can be exploited by those willing to operate without limits. Perhaps most revealing was what the meltdown suggested about fear. Rage often masks anxiety, particularly the anxiety of losing control over the narrative or the process. When power reacts explosively to oversight, it signals that oversight is effective. The intensity of the response becomes indirect confirmation that scrutiny has struck a sensitive point. The meltdown that exposed everything did not expose secrets as much as it exposed priorities. It showed what happens when authority is confronted with boundaries it does not accept, when rules interrupt dominance, and when accountability refuses to yield to intimidation. In that exposure lies a clearer understanding of the stakes, the strategies at play, and the fragile line between democratic restraint and unchecked power. Congress's demand is not about politics, it's about precedent. It's about whether future leaders will be held to the same standards, or whether accountability itself becomes optional for the powerful. And the response we're seeing, this explosive, unrestrained reaction, tells us far more than any document ever could. It tells us that oversight works, it tells us that the demand landed exactly where it was supposed to, and it tells us that the system, though strained, is still functioning. Rachel Maddow has long emphasized that democracy doesn't collapse in one dramatic moment. It erodes when norms are ignored, when institutions are attacked, and when the public is conditioned to see accountability as betrayal. That's why this moment matters. Because the real question isn't whether Donald Trump is angry. The real question is whether the country allows anger to override the law, whether volume replaces truth, whether loyalty replaces responsibility. History will not remember the tweets. It will remember whether Congress stood firm, whether institutions held, and whether the American people understood what was at stake. This is not about left versus right, this is about democracy versus disorder, and no meltdown, no matter how explosive, can change that fundamental truth. Thank you.